The photographs were taken from inside my tent. I know this because I can see the mesh of the inner canopy in the upper right corner of the frame, the same distinctive gray diamond pattern that North Face uses on the Stormbreak series. I can see my sleeping bag, the blue marmot trestles I've had since undergrad. I can see my boots placed neatly beside my sleeping pad, the way I always leave them, toes pointing toward the door for a quick exit. And I can see myself, lying on my back with my mouth slightly open, dead asleep, completely unaware that someone was crouching at the foot of my tent with a camera, photographing me at what the metadata on the image file would later confirm was 3:22 in the morning. My name is Kira. In the summer of 2024, I was 24 years old, and in the first year of my PhD program in geology at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. My research focused on glacial retreat in Rocky Mountain National Park, specifically the Tyndall Glacier and the surrounding cirque formations in the Wild Basin area on the park's southeastern boundary. Wild Basin is one of the quieter sections of Rocky Mountain National Park. It doesn't get the traffic that Bear Lake or Trail Ridge Road gets. The trailhead sits at the end of a narrow road off Highway 7, about 13 miles south of Estes Park, and most of the day hikers who come through are heading to Uzel Falls or Calypso Cascades, two popular waterfalls in the first 3 miles of the trail. Beyond that, the trail climbs into alpine terrain that gets progressively more remote. By the time you reach Thunder Lake at about 7 miles, you're above 10,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that still hold snow in July, and the odds of seeing another person drop to near zero on weekdays. My fieldwork involved hiking to 3 GPS-marked study sites above Thunder Lake, collecting rock samples, photographing glacial features, and taking measurements with a handheld LiDAR unit. The work required multiple overnight trips, as the study sites were too far from the trailhead for day access, and some of the measurements needed to be taken at specific times relative to sun angle. I typically camped at the Thunder Lake Backcountry site, a designated spot near the lakeshore with a fire ring, a food storage pole, and a flat area large enough for 2 or 3 tents. During weekdays in late June and early July, I was usually the only person there. The field station was something I found by accident. On my third trip to Wild Basin in late June, I was hiking an off-trail route to my upper study site, scrambling over a talus field above the lake, when I spotted a structure partially hidden behind a cluster of boulders at the base of a cliff band. It was a small cabin, maybe 10 by 12 feet, built from weathered lumber with a corrugated metal roof that had rusted to the color of dried blood. The door was a plywood sheet on leather hinges. There were no windows. The structure was invisible from the main trail and would have been invisible from the lake as well, hidden by the boulder field and a stand of crumholtz, the twisted, wind-stunted spruce that grows at treeline in the Rockies. I assumed it was an old research station or storage cache. Rocky Mountain National Park has a long history of scientific research, and there are several legacy structures in the backcountry that date from the 1960s and 70s, when the park hosted more extensive field programs. Most of them are documented and either maintained or scheduled for removal. I made a mental note to ask my advisor about it and continued to my study site. The cabin stayed in the back of my mind for the next few days. When I returned to Fort Collins, I searched the park's historical records and found a reference to a weather monitoring station that had been established in the Wild Basin area in 1971 as part of a USGS Alpine climate study. The station had been decommissioned in 1984 when the study ended, and the records indicated that the structure was to be dismantled and the site restored. But based on what I had seen, it had never been dismantled. It was still there, 40 years later, tucked behind a boulder field at 11,000 feet where no one ever went. There is something about working alone above treeline that changes your relationship with silence. Below treeline, silence is relative. There's always the sound of wind and leaves, birds, insects, the creak of wood. Above treeline, the silence is structural. The wind is the only sound, and when the wind stops, you hear nothing at all, just the pressure of altitude in your ears and the sound of your own breathing. I'd gotten used to this. I'd even come to need it. The quiet allowed me to think in a way that the noise of the university and the city never did. My fieldwork was solitary and precise and grounding, but solitary also means vulnerable. Solitary means that if something happens, there is no one to witness it, no one to call for help, no one to say you were wrong to go alone. I told my advisor, Dr. Elaine Marsh, about the cabin when I got back from my third trip. She was interested from a historical perspective and encouraged me to document it. She said there were several decommissioned research structures in the park that had never been properly inventoried, and that documenting them could be useful for a future historical ecology project. She didn't seem concerned about the cabin itself. It was an old building in the backcountry. There are hundreds of them across the national park system. On my next trip, the second week of July, I hiked to the cabin with the intention of documenting it for the Park Service. I brought my camera and a notepad. The door was not locked. There was no lock, just a loop of paracord that held it closed against the wind. I pulled the cord and pushed the plywood open. The inside of the cabin was not abandoned. There was a foam sleeping pad on the floor, rolled out and covered with a wool blanket. There was a plastic storage bin against one wall containing canned food, a camp stove, fuel canisters, a first aid kit, and several gallon jugs of water. There was a shelf made from a plank balanced on two rocks, holding a row of books, mostly field guides and a few paperback novels, all of them weathered and swollen from moisture. There was a propane lantern hanging from a nail in the ceiling beam. There was a folding camp chair. And on the wall opposite the door, taped to the lumber in a neat grid, there were photographs. The photographs were of the Wild Basin Trail, the Trailhead parking lot, the Calypso Cascades Bridge, the Thunder Lake shoreline, the backcountry campsite where I had been sleeping. They were printed on standard photo paper, inkjet quality, and they appeared to have been taken over a period of months based on the seasonal variation. Some showed snow on the ground, others showed summer wildflowers. They were all landscape shots, except for 3 in the bottom row. Those 3 showed people. Hikers on the trail, photographed from a distance with what appeared to be a telephoto lens. Their faces were not clearly visible, but their gear and clothing were identifiable. One of the 3 was a woman in a red jacket carrying a blue day pack. I recognized the jacket. It was mine. I stepped out of the cabin and stood in the boulder field and felt my heart beating in my throat. The photo of the woman in the red jacket had been taken from above and behind, from a position that could only have been the talus field I crossed on my way to the upper study site. Whoever took it had been watching me from the rocks while I hiked. They had a telephoto lens. They were close enough to get a clear image, but far enough that I never saw them. I pulled the photo off the wall and took it with me. I also took photos of the interior with my phone, documenting the supplies, the books, the photo grid, everything. Then I closed the door and hiked back to the Thunder Lake campsite, where I had left my tent and research equipment. I tried to work that afternoon, tried to focus on sample collection and LiDAR readings, but my hands were unsteady and my attention kept drifting to the surrounding terrain. Wild Basin above Thunder Lake is vast and vertical. Cliff bands, boulder fields, talus slopes, crumb-hole stands. A person who knew this terrain could watch someone at the lake from a dozen different positions without ever being visible. I had been coming here for weeks. How many times had I been observed without knowing it? I considered hiking out immediately, but it was already late afternoon, and the 7-mile trail back to the trailhead includes 2 exposed ridge crossings that I did not want to navigate in fading light with a full pack and shaking hands. So I made a decision I have second-guessed 100 times since. I stayed one more night. I moved my tent. I took it down from the designated campsite and relocated to a spot about 200 yards south in a small depression between 2 large boulders that partially shielded me from the uphill sightline to the cabin and the talus field. It was not an official campsite, and in any other circumstance I would have felt guilty about it, but I could not bring myself to sleep in a location that someone had been surveilling with a telephoto lens. I ate a cold dinner, because I didn't want the smell of a camp stove advertising my position, and I wedged a trekking pole across the inside of my tent vestibule so that the zipper could not be opened from outside without knocking it loose and making noise. That night, I did not sleep well. I lay in my tent and listened to the wind coming down from the Continental Divide, a constant low moan that sounds like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. The temperature dropped into the 30s. I could hear the lake lapping against the rocks 50 yards from my tent. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to a sound that I cannot explain in any way that doesn't make my skin crawl. It was the sound of a camera shutter, not a phone camera, which makes a digital approximation, a mechanical shutter, the actual click advance of a film or DSLR camera. It was inside my tent vestibule. Then I heard footsteps, quick and light, moving away over the rocky ground. I didn't move. I lay perfectly still with my eyes open, staring at the mesh ceiling, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, and listened to the footsteps fade into the distance. They moved uphill, toward the talus field, toward the cabin. I waited until they were completely gone. Then I waited another 10 minutes. Then I unzipped my tent and turned on my headlamp and checked outside. My vestibule was unzipped about 8 inches. I always zip it completely. There were no objects left behind, no obvious signs of disturbance. But someone had been there, standing over me while I slept, and I had not woken up until they were already leaving. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 minutes, replaying the sound in my head. The mechanical click of a shutter, the deliberate controlled sound of someone who had practiced moving quietly on rocky ground. This was not a random encounter. This was not a curious hiker who wandered into my camp by mistake. This person had walked to my tent in the dark, unzipped the vestibule without waking me, leaned in close enough to photograph my face, and then left. The precision of it was the most terrifying part. They knew exactly what they were doing. I packed my camp in the dark. I didn't wait for dawn. I hiked the 7 miles back to the trailhead by headlamp, moving faster than I have ever moved on a trail, stumbling over roots and rocks, my pack banging against my back, not stopping once. I reached my car at approximately 5:15 in the morning and drove directly to the Estes Park Ranger Station on Highway 36. I showed them the photograph of myself, the photos of the cabin interior, and gave a full statement. Park law enforcement rangers hiked to the cabin that same day. They confirmed everything I had reported. The cabin, the supplies, the photograph grid. They also found things I had missed in my brief and terrified inspection. A journal, handwritten in a small spiral notebook, documenting daily observations of weather, wildlife, and trail traffic in Wild Basin. The entries spanned nearly 8 months. A memory card for a digital camera containing over 600 photographs. Many of them were landscape and wildlife shots, but 43 of them were photographs of hikers taken without their knowledge from elevated positions using a telephoto lens. 7 of those photographs were of me, taken over the course of my 4 field trips to Wild Basin, documenting my arrival, my camp setup, my hiking routes, and my work at the study sites. The final 3 photos on the card were the ones taken inside my tent. The metadata confirmed they were shot at 3:22, 3:23, and 3:24 in the morning on the night I woke up to the shutter sound. The Park Service identified the occupant within a week. His name was Dale Fenwick, 61 years old. He had been a research technician with the USGS from 1978 to 1996, working on alpine ecology and climate monitoring projects across several national parks, including Rocky Mountain. He had been assigned to the Wild Basin Weather Station during its final years of operation in the early 1980s and had spent multiple field seasons living and working at that exact cabin. After the USGS restructured its field programs in the late 90s, Fenwick had been laid off. He bounced between seasonal positions with the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management for several years before dropping off the employment radar entirely around 2005. What the investigators pieced together was that Fenwick had returned to the decommissioned cabin sometime in late 2023 and had been living there intermittently, spending weeks or months at a time in the backcountry before hiking out to resupply. His food and water supplies were consistent with extended stays. His journal entries suggested he viewed the Wild Basin area as his territory, a place where he had done meaningful work decades earlier and where he felt he still belonged. The photographs of hikers were not threatening in their content, no aggressive poses, no confrontational framing, but they demonstrated a pattern of surveillance that was deeply unsettling in its scope and duration. He had been watching people from the rocks for months, documenting their movements with the same methodical precision he had once applied to scientific field observation. The ranger who briefed me on the findings said something that I have thought about every day since. He said that Fenwick's journal contained detailed notes on my research activities. He had written about my study sites, my sampling methodology, even the brand and model of my LiDAR unit. He had been close enough to read the label. He had been watching me work from positions in the boulder field that were sometimes less than 50 yards from where I was collecting samples. I had never seen him. Not once. Dale Fenwick was contacted by park rangers at a motel in Allens Park, Colorado, about 15 miles from the park boundary, where he had been staying during a resupply trip. He cooperated fully and was charged with trespassing on federal land, unauthorized habitation of a government structure, and stalking. The stalking charge was based on the photographs taken inside my tent, which the prosecutor argued demonstrated an escalating pattern of invasive behavior. Fenwick's attorney maintained that his client had no intention to harm anyone and was suffering from social isolation and a long-standing attachment to the field station that he had helped build 40 years earlier. The case was still pending when I last checked. I completed my summer fieldwork using a different study area in the park, accessed from the Bear Lake corridor, where there are more people and more visibility. I never went back to Wild Basin. The Park Service dismantled the cabin in August 2024 and restored the site to its natural condition, removing every trace of the structure that Dale Fenwick had been returning to for the better part of a year. They also installed motion-activated trail cameras along the approach routes to Thunder Lake as a precautionary measure. My advisor understood my decision to change study areas. The other grad students in my lab understood. Everyone understood. But I still think about the cabin and the photographs and the 7 images of me on that memory card, each one taken from a position I never noticed, at a distance I never suspected. The idea that someone was watching me work, watching me hike, watching me sleep for weeks without my knowledge, in a place where I felt safe because it was empty. That is what stays with me. If you do research or recreation in remote backcountry areas, never assume you are alone simply because you cannot see anyone. Always tell your research group or a trusted contact your exact itinerary, including GPS coordinates if possible, and check in at predetermined intervals. If you find an unexpected structure or signs of habitation in the backcountry, do not enter it. Document it from a distance and report it to the appropriate land management agency. And carry a satellite communicator. A phone is not enough above tree line where there is no signal, and the time it takes to hike back to cell service could be the difference between a close call and a crisis. The campsite was identical to mine. Same green 2-person tent, same brand, same orientation with the door facing east, same blue tarp rigged between 2 trees at the same height, same black dry bag hanging from the same type of bear line, using the same PCT method I had learned from a YouTube video 3 weeks earlier. I was standing on a ridge above the HOH River, about 9 miles into the backcountry of Olympic National Park, looking down at a camp that could have been a mirror image of the one I had set up a 1/4 mile upstream. Except I hadn't set up 2 camps, and the person who had set this one up wasn't there. My name is Eli. In the summer of 2023, I was 26 years old and in the 2nd year of my master's program in environmental science at the University of Washington in Seattle. I had been volunteering with the National Park Service as a backcountry trail monitor since the previous spring, a position that involved hiking designated sections of trail in Olympic National Park, documenting conditions, reporting hazards, and occasionally interacting with hikers who needed directions or had questions about permits. It wasn't a paid position, but it counted toward my field hours, and it gave me access to parts of the park that most visitors never see. The HOH Rainforest is one of the largest temperate rainforests in the United States, a sprawling cathedral of Sitka spruce, western red cedar, and big-leaf maple draped in club moss, so thick it looks like the trees are wearing fur coats. The canopy blocks most of the sunlight, and even on a clear July afternoon, the forest floor exists in a kind of permanent green twilight. The air smells like wet earth and decomposing wood, and something faintly sweet that I was told is the moss itself, releasing spores. It is one of the most beautiful and most disorienting places I have ever been. The HOH River Trail runs roughly 18 miles from the visitor center to Glacier Meadows at the base of Mount Olympus. The first 12 miles follow the river through old-growth forest, flat and relatively easy. After that, the trail climbs steeply into alpine terrain. Most backpackers camp at designated sites along the river, but backcountry camping is permitted with a wilderness permit, and in the off-peak months, you can go days without seeing another person. My monitoring route covered a 10-mile section from the 5-mile island area to the Olympus Guard Station, and I typically did it as a 2-night trip, camping at Lewis Meadow on the first night and near the guard station on the second. The duplicate campsite appeared on a Tuesday in mid-August. I had hiked in that morning from the trailhead, starting at 6 to beat the heat, though heat is a relative term in the HOH. It rarely gets above 75 degrees, and the humidity under the canopy keeps everything damp. I reached Lewis Meadow by early afternoon and set up camp in my usual spot, a flat area near the river about 30 yards off the trail, shielded by a stand of spruce. I hung my food bag, filtered water, made notes on a downed tree I had flagged on my previous trip, and then decided to hike a little farther upstream to check on a section of trail that had been reported as partially washed out by spring flooding. That is when I found the other camp. It was about a quarter mile from mine, on a slightly elevated bench above the river. I saw the green tent first, through a gap in the trees, and my initial thought was that another hiker had set up nearby. Normal. But as I got closer, I noticed the similarities. The tent was a REI Half Dome 2+, the same model I use. Same sage green color. The rainfly was configured exactly the way I configure mine, with the vestibule partially rolled back and clipped to the side. The tarp was a blue Kelty Noah's 12-foot, rigged in a diamond configuration between two trees at approximately the same height as mine. The bear hang was a black sea to summit dry bag on a line thrown over a branch using the counterbalance method. I stood there for a long time. The rational part of my brain said coincidence. REI half-dome tents are one of the most popular backpacking tents in the country. Blue tarps are ubiquitous. The counterbalance bear hang is taught in every wilderness skills class. People buy the same gear. People set up camp in similar ways. But there was something about the precision of it that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just similar gear. It was the same arrangement, the same distances between elements. The tent door faced east, the way mine did. The tarp was angled to shed rain to the north, the way mine was. The bear hang was approximately 20 feet from the tent at 2 o'clock, the way mine was. I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" My voice sounded flat and muffled under the canopy, absorbed by the moss and the damp air before it could carry. No response. I walked the perimeter of the camp, staying about 10 feet out. The fire ring had cold ash in it, maybe a day or two old. There was a water filter sitting on a flat rock beside a Nalgene bottle. The filter was a Sawyer squeeze, same as mine. The Nalgene was the wide-mouth 32-ounce, same as mine. I told myself to stop cataloging the similarities because I was feeding my own paranoia, but I couldn't stop. I didn't touch anything. I went back to my camp and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to study the trail condition notes I was supposed to be compiling, but I kept looking upstream toward the other camp, as if I expected someone to emerge from the trees. No one did. That evening, as the light dimmed to that deep green-gray that passes for dusk in the rainforest, I walked back to the other camp. It was exactly as I had left it. No one had returned. The tent was zipped shut. I thought about opening it but didn't. Instead, I went back to my own camp, ate dinner, and crawled into my tent with my headlamp and my field notebook. I wrote down everything I had observed, the gear, the layout, the distances. I drew a rough diagram of both campsites and compared them. They were close to identical. Not similar. Identical. I slept badly. I kept waking to sounds that I normally would have ignored. The river. The wind in the canopy, which in the HOH sounds like breathing because the moss dampens the higher frequencies and leaves this low, rhythmic susurration. a branch cracking somewhere in the dark, an elk bugling far off to the south. At some point around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps. Not the heavy crunch of an elk or deer on the forest floor, but the careful, deliberate sound of boots on soft ground. They passed within what I estimated was 50 yards of my tent, moving upstream, toward the other camp. I lay still and listened until the sound faded. In the morning, I packed up fast and hiked to the other camp. It had changed. The tent was still there, still zipped, but the tarp had been adjusted. It was now rigged in an A-frame configuration instead of the diamond. When I had packed up my own camp, I had briefly considered switching my tarp to A-frame because the forecast called for heavier rain that afternoon. I had decided against it and rolled the tarp into my pack instead. Whoever was at this camp had made the choice I almost made. They had been watching me. I hiked to the Olympus Guard Station and used the emergency radio to contact the HOH Rainforest Ranger Station. I spoke with a ranger named Deb, who I had worked with on several previous trips. I told her about the duplicate campsite and the footsteps. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and then asked me a series of questions. How far off trail was the camp? Was there any indication of how long it had been established? Did I see any footprints? Were there any signs of permanent habitation like cached food or constructed shelters? I answered as best I could. The camp was roughly 40 yards off the main trail, on the river bench. The fire ring ash suggested at least a few days. The ground was too mossy and soft to hold clear footprints. I had not seen cached food or constructed shelters, but I had not searched thoroughly because I didn't want to disturb anything. Deb told me to continue my monitoring route, and she would send a ranger to investigate the site within the next day or two. She also told me something that made the cold feeling in my stomach much worse. This was not the first report of this kind. Over the previous 2 summers, 3 separate backcountry hikers had reported finding campsites in the HOH River corridor that appeared to mirror their own setups. 2 of the reports came from the Lewis Meadow area. 1 came from farther upstream near Elk Lake. In each case, the reporting hiker described finding a campsite within a quarter to half mile of their own, using gear that was visually identical or very similar, arranged in a layout that closely matched theirs. In each case, the campsite was unoccupied when found, and in each case, the hiker reported hearing footsteps or movement at night. No one had been injured. No one had been directly confronted. But one hiker, a woman from Portland who had been camping solo near Lewis Meadow in July of the previous year, reported that she woke up in the middle of the night to find a new item at her campsite that hadn't been there when she went to sleep. A Nalgene bottle filled with filtered water sitting on a rock beside her tent. She hadn't put it there. She packed up and hiked out in the dark. I continued my monitoring route that day, but I changed my camping plan. Instead of camping near the guard station, I hiked an extra 3 miles to a spot I knew well, a small clearing near a tributary creek that was off the standard camping areas. I chose it because it was surrounded by dense brush that would make it very difficult to approach without making noise. I set up my tent differently than usual. I changed the orientation, put the door facing south instead of east, and didn't hang a tarp at all. I wanted to see if the copycat pattern would break if I changed my setup. I ate dinner in the failing light and sat on a log by the creek, listening. The HOH at night is not silent. It's full of sound, but all of it organic, all of it constant. Water, wind, insects, the occasional owl. What it is not full of is human sound. No traffic, no planes, no music, no voices. You become acutely tuned to anything that breaks that natural pattern. At approximately 11:20 at night, while I was lying in my tent reading by headlamp, I heard something that did not belong. It was a zipper. The sound of a tent zipper being opened or closed, that distinctive ripping Velcro noise that every backpacker knows. It came from the east, from the direction of the main trail, maybe 200 yards away, maybe less. Sound carries unpredictably in the rainforest. I turned off my headlamp and lay still. I heard nothing else, but I did not sleep. At first light, I packed my camp and hiked east, toward where I had heard the zipper. I found it in a small clearing about 150 yards from my position, a green REI half-dome, 2+ tent, sage green, unoccupied. But this time, the configuration was different. The door faced south, no tarp. The same changes I had made to my own setup the previous evening. Whoever this was had watched me set up, noted the changes, and replicated them. I stood in front of that tent and felt something I had never felt before in the wilderness. Not fear exactly, but the sickening recognition that I was inside someone else's game and had been since the moment I arrived. Every decision I had made about my camp, the orientation, the tarp, the bear hang, had been observed, recorded, and reproduced. I was not alone in this forest. I had never been alone in this forest. I took photos of the campsite with my phone, close-ups of the tent, the lack of a tarp, the configuration. Then I packed up and moved fast. I didn't follow the main trail. I took a game path I knew from my monitoring work that cut south to the river and followed the gravel bar downstream. It added about 40 minutes to the hike, but kept me off the established trail where I felt most exposed. Twice during that hike, I stopped and listened, standing completely still for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, scanning the tree line. Both times I heard nothing but the river and the wind. But both times I had the distinct sensation of being watched, that prickling awareness at the base of my skull that evolution gave us for exactly this kind of situation. I didn't wait for Deb to send a ranger. I hiked out. I left the backcountry that morning and drove to the ranger station at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, where I gave a full report in person. The head ranger, a man named Carl Westbrook, who had been with the park for over 20 years, sat with me for an hour. He told me what they knew. The Park Service had been quietly investigating the situation for almost 18 months. They believed a single individual was responsible for all the reported incidents. Based on the pattern of locations and the timing of reports, they had narrowed the area of activity to a roughly 4-mile stretch of the Hoh River corridor between 5 Mile Island and Lewis Meadow. The individual appeared to be living in the backcountry, moving between concealed campsites and systematically observing backpackers who camped in the area. The copycat camping behavior was consistent across all reports. The individual would observe a hiker's camp setup from a distance, often using the dense old-growth forest and moss cover as concealment, then establish a nearly identical camp nearby, apparently for the purpose of demonstrating that they had been watching. Carl described it as territorial behavior, a way of communicating to hikers that this was someone else's territory and they were being monitored. They had a suspect, a man named Gordon Price, 53 years old, who had been a seasonal trail crew worker for the park in 2019 and 2020. Price had been let go after the 2020 season for what Carl described as erratic behavior and boundary issues with other crew members. He had intimate knowledge of the Hoh River corridor, including the location of unmapped social trails, game paths, and natural shelters that weren't on any official documentation. Price had a history of living rough. He had no permanent address and had previously been contacted by law enforcement in Jefferson County for camping on private timberland. After being terminated from the Park Service, he had not been seen or officially contacted again. 2 weeks after my report, a ranger patrol found one of Price's concealed camps in a dense stand of old-growth spruce about 200 yards off the main trail between Lewis Meadow and 5 Mile Island. It was not a tent. It was a low structure built from fallen branches, moss, and sheets of bark, so well camouflaged that the rangers told me they had walked past it twice before spotting it. Inside, they found a sleeping pad, a tarp, canned food, water containers, and a collection of gear that matched descriptions from multiple hiker reports. Green REI tents, blue tarps, Sawyer water filters, Nalgene bottles. He had multiples of the same popular items, a kit designed to replicate whatever setup he observed. Gordon Price was located by Jefferson County Sheriff's deputies 3 weeks later at a gas station in Forks, Washington, about 30 miles from the park boundary. He had lost significant weight and his clothes were heavily worn. Deputies said he smelled like campfire smoke and damp earth, the kind of smell that doesn't come from a weekend trip, but from months of continuous exposure. He did not resist arrest. He was charged with criminal trespass and harassment. During his interview, he reportedly told investigators that the HOH River corridor was his home and that he had been there long before the hikers and would be there long after. He said the copycat camps were warnings. He wanted people to know they were being watched so they would leave. He said he never intended to hurt anyone. He just wanted to be left alone in what he considered his territory. The charges were later expanded to include theft, based on evidence that some of the duplicate gear found at his concealed camp had been stolen from other hikers' campsites while they were away on day hikes. The tents, the tarps, the water filters. He had been taking items from unattended camps, using them to build his replica setups, and then abandoning them when the hiker left the area. The whole system was designed around observation and control, a way of asserting dominance over a territory he believed was his. I finished my monitoring season that September and returned to Seattle for the fall semester. I haven't been back to the HOH since. I still backpack, but I choose different areas now, and I pay attention to things I never paid attention to before. I check the ground around my camp for signs that someone has been nearby. I vary my setup. I never use the same configuration twice in the same trip, and I never, ever camp near a site that looks like someone deliberately placed it to be found. If you camp in the backcountry, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where the vegetation can hide a person 20 feet from you, always file a trip plan with someone who will notice if you don't check in. Always carry a satellite communicator or a personal locator beacon, not just a phone. Trust the feeling when something seems wrong, because in the wilderness, your instincts are processing information your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. The forest doesn't owe you safety. You owe yourself the awareness to recognize when something in it has changed. The elk bugle came from the wrong direction. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd been sitting in a ground blind on the north slope of Cataloochee Valley since 4:30 in the morning, waiting for the herd to move through the meadow at first light the way they had every morning that week. The sound came from the South Ridge, which was uphill, heavily wooded, and not where elk feed at dawn. Elk move downhill in the morning to graze in open meadows and river bottoms. They don't climb ridges in the dark. But the bugle was perfect. Pitch, duration, the trailing whistle at the end. If I hadn't spent 3 years recording elk vocalizations across the southern Appalachians, I might not have questioned it. But I had. And the sound was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, like hearing a word pronounced correctly by someone who doesn't speak the language. My name is Jared. In the fall of 2023, I was 31 years old and working as a freelance wildlife photographer based out of Asheville, North Carolina. I had a contract with a regional conservation magazine to produce a photo essay on the reintroduced elk herd in the Great Smoky Mountains, a population that had been brought back from extinction in the southern Appalachians through a release program that started in 2001. The elk in Cataloochee Valley are one of the great conservation success stories in the eastern United States. A herd of roughly 200 animals descended from the original 52 that were relocated from land between the lakes in Kentucky. They had become one of the most popular wildlife viewing attractions in the national park, drawing thousands of visitors to the valley every fall during the rut, when the bulls bugle and spar in the open meadows surrounded by mountains that look like they've been there since the beginning of time. Cataloochee is a strange and beautiful place. It sits in the southeastern corner of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, accessed by a narrow, winding gravel road that drops into the valley from the Blue Ridge Parkway. The valley was once home to a thriving community of mountain families, and the remnants of their settlement are still there. White clapboard churches, a schoolhouse, old homestead foundations scattered through the woods. The meadows where the elk graze are the same fields those families cleared for farming over a century ago. At night, with the mountains closing in on all sides and no artificial light for miles, the valley feels less like a national park and more like a pocket of time that the modern world forgot to reach. The drive into Cataloochee alone sets the tone. The last 4 miles of road are unpaved, a single-lane gravel track that winds through the mountains with no guardrails and drops of several hundred feet on the passenger side. You pass through a tunnel of overhanging trees so dense that your headlights are the only light source even at midday. Cell service disappears about 2 miles before you reach the valley floor. There is no gas station, no store, no emergency services within the valley itself. The nearest hospital is in Waynesville, about 45 minutes away, on roads that are not designed for speed. This is a place where if something goes wrong, you handle it yourself, or you wait. I had been camping in the valley for 6 days when I heard the wrong bugle. My camp was at the designated backcountry site near the Caldwell Fork Trail junction, about 1.5 miles from the main meadow. The site was basic, a flat spot in the woods with a fire ring and a bear cable for hanging food. I had a 3-person tent that I used as a mobile base, camera gear stored in dry bags, and a daily routine that revolved around the elk's schedule. Wake before dawn, hike to the blind, photograph from first light until the herd moved into the trees around 9, then spend the midday hours scouting locations, checking trail cameras, and editing files on my laptop in camp. Return to the meadow in late afternoon for the evening feeding session, then back to camp after dark. The wrong bugle happened on a Thursday morning. I was in my blind on the north slope, which gave me a clear sightline across the main meadow. The herd had been moving through this meadow every morning between 6:15 and 6:45, coming from the east where they bedded down in a stand of old-growth hemlock. I was expecting them from the east. The bugle came from the south, from the forested ridge that separates Cataloochee Valley from the Big Creek watershed. I turned my head and listened. It came again. A full bugle, starting with a low guttural growl, rising to the high-pitched scream, then trailing off into a series of rhythmic grunts. Textbook. But elk don't bugle from dense ridgeline timber at 5:45 in the morning during the pre-rut. They bugle from meadows and clearings where the sound carries and other bulls can hear it. Bugling from a closed canopy ridge is like shouting into a pillow. It makes no tactical sense for an animal that uses vocalization to establish territorial dominance. I recorded the sound on my phone. I carry a directional microphone for audio capture in the field, but it was in my camera bag and I didn't want to risk the noise of unzipping it. The phone recording was low quality, but captured the basic pattern. I played it back later that morning and compared it to my archive of elk recordings from the same valley. The pitch was slightly off, about a quarter tone high, which is within natural variation, but consistently high across both bugles I recorded. A real elk's pitch varies between bugles. This one was locked to the same frequency both times, like a recording being played back. I mentioned it to a park volunteer named Brenda, who was staffing the Valley Information Station that morning. She looked at me for a long moment and then asked if I had heard it more than once. I said twice from the same direction. She told me that 3 other visitors had reported hearing elk vocalizations from the South Ridge over the previous 2 weeks, always in the early morning hours, always from the same general area. She said the park biologist had been notified but hadn't found any evidence of elk activity on that ridge. No tracks, no scat, no browse marks. Whatever was making that sound was not an elk. I thanked Brenda and walked back to the meadow. The elk were still feeding in the morning sun, unbothered, the cows grazing with their heads down while 2 young bulls sparred half-heartedly near the tree line. Looking at them, you would think nothing in this valley was out of place. Everything about the scene was peaceful and postcard perfect. But I kept glancing at the South Ridge, at the dark line of trees that rose above the meadow like a wall. And I kept thinking about how easy it would be to sit up there, hidden in the laurel and the hemlock, and watch everything below without ever being seen. I am not a person who scares easily. I've spent hundreds of nights alone in the backcountry across the Appalachian Range, from Georgia to Virginia. I've encountered black bears at close range, been charged by a cow elk protecting a calf, and once had a timber rattlesnake coiled on top of my tent stuff sack when I went to pack up in the morning. None of those things affected my willingness to be in the woods, but the idea that someone was in the trees on that ridge, producing elk bugles accurate enough to fool casual listeners for purposes I could not explain, put a weight in my chest that I carried for the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't settle. I lay in my tent and listened to the valley. Cataloochee at night sounds the way you'd imagine. Owls calling across the meadow, coyotes yipping in the distance, the creek running over rocks, and then, at approximately 10:30, another bugle from the south ridge. This time it was followed by something new, a cow call, the mewing, nasal sound that a cow elk makes to communicate with her calf or with other cows. Then another bugle. Then silence. I sat up in my sleeping bag and pulled out my phone and hit record. The silence lasted about 4 minutes. Then a single bugle, closer than the others. It was on my side of the ridge now, moving downhill toward the valley floor, toward the meadow, toward my camp. I thought about packing up and leaving. I thought about it seriously. The smart thing, the survival brain thing, would have been to hike to my car and drive back to Asheville and file a report from the safety of my apartment on Merriman Avenue. But I had been in this valley for 6 days. I had over 4,000 images and 60 hours of audio recordings invested in this project. And I am, for better or worse, the kind of person who needs to understand what he's seeing before he can walk away from it. The next morning, Friday, I set up in my blind again. But this time I brought my directional microphone and my best telephoto lens, a Canon 600mm 4 that I had rented specifically for this trip. I aimed it at the south ridge and waited. The elk herd came through the meadow at their usual time, feeding in the wet grass, the cows and calves bunched together with 2 bulls circling the perimeter. At approximately 7:15, while I was tracking one of the bulls through my viewfinder, I heard another bugle from the south ridge. I swung the lens uphill and scanned the tree line. At 600 millimeters with a 1.4 times extender, I could see individual branches at that distance. I swept the ridge slowly, left to right, holding my breath to keep the image steady. I saw a movement, not an elk. A human figure, partially obscured by a laurel thicket, about 2/3 of the way up the ridge. The person was wearing dark clothing, olive or brown, and appeared to be crouched or sitting against a tree. I pressed the shutter. The autofocus hunted for a moment, then locked. I got 3 frames before the figure moved deeper into the laurel and disappeared. When I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD, the figure was small in the frame and partially blocked by branches. But it was clearly a person, and in one of the 3 frames, I could see the person's hands raised to their mouth, holding something tubular, making the call. I did something that every wilderness safety instructor would tell you not to do. I got out of my tent, I pulled on my boots and my headlamp and grabbed my bear spray canister, the big counter-assault model that shoots 32 feet, and I walked to the edge of the meadow. The grass was wet with dew and shin-high, silver in the moonlight. The south ridge was a dark wall against the sky. I stood there and listened. Nothing. The bugling had stopped. But across the meadow, at the base of the south ridge where the tree line met the grass, I saw a light. Not a flashlight, not a headlamp. A small, steady orange light, like a cigarette or a small fire. It was there for maybe 15 seconds. Then it went out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with my bear spray and my phone and waited for dawn. At first light, I packed my camera gear and hiked to the south side of the meadow. The tree line was dense, second-growth hardwoods with thick understory, the kind of woods where visibility drops to 20 feet within a few steps. I found a faint game trail leading uphill into the ridge. About 300 yards in, I found the source of the orange light. A small fire pit, barely 18 inches across, dug into the forest floor and lined with rocks. The ash was fresh. Beside it, I found 3 things. A plastic shopping bag from the Ingalls supermarket in Maggie Valley, containing 2 empty cans of Vienna sausages and a spent Bic lighter. A homemade elk call, carved from a section of PVC pipe with a latex reed glued inside, and a pair of binoculars in a soft case, old but functional, Bushnell brand, with dried mud on the focus wheel. The binoculars were pointed downhill. From that position on the ridge with those binoculars, you could see the entire Cataloochee Valley meadow. You could see the trail junction. You could see the designated backcountry campsite where my tent was pitched. You could count the guy lines. I crouched beside the fire pit and looked at the binoculars and the PVC call and the trash and tried to put together a picture that made sense. Someone was spending extended time on this ridge, close enough to observe the entire valley, using a homemade tool to produce elk calls that were sophisticated enough to fool most listeners. They were doing this repeatedly, over a period of weeks, based on the multiple reports Brenda had mentioned. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was deliberate, sustained, and organized. I also found something I almost missed. About 15 feet from the fire pit, partially hidden under a layer of fallen leaves, there was a burlap sack. Inside it were bundles of ginseng root, still dirty, freshly dug, with the characteristic forked shape and ring-scarred necks that distinguish wild Appalachian ginseng from cultivated plants. There must have been 2 or 3 pounds of root in that sack, which I later learned was worth somewhere between $1,200 and $3,000 depending on the buyer. I took photos of everything and hiked out to the information station. Brenda wasn't there yet, so I drove the gravel road out to Interstate 40 and called the park's law enforcement tip line from the gas station in Waterville. I spoke with a ranger named Sergeant Dylan McBride, who asked me to email the photos and said he would have investigators on site within 24 hours. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The PVC elk call was distinctive enough to be useful. Park law enforcement had been working a separate case involving illegal ginseng poaching in the Big Creek watershed, just over the ridge from Cataloochee. Ginseng is a protected plant in the national park, and wild harvested ginseng from Appalachian forests can sell for $600 to $1,000 a pound. Poaching it from national park land is a federal offense. The poaching operation had been active for at least 2 seasons based on harvest evidence found by park botanists who monitored ginseng populations. The elk call mimicry was the deterrent. The poachers, a pair of men from Haywood County named Russell Barnett and his nephew Tyler Conley, had been using fake elk vocalizations to keep hikers, photographers, and park visitors away from the South Ridge, which was their primary harvest area. During the fall rut season, when the valley was busiest with elk viewers, they would produce bugles and cow calls from the ridge to create the impression that elk were moving through the timber up there, which actually discouraged most visitors from going up because the viewing was better in the open meadow below. For anyone who did get curious and venture toward the ridge, the nighttime calls and the visible fire were meant to suggest the presence of a camper or hunter, someone you wouldn't want to stumble into in the dark woods. Russell Barnett was 57 years old and had grown up in a hollow outside Maggie Valley. He had been harvesting ginseng from the Smoky Mountains since he was a teenager, long before the area was heavily patrolled. Tyler Conley was 24 and had learned the trade from his uncle. Both were arrested in November 2023 after park investigators, using trail cameras and a 2-week stakeout coordinated with the Bureau of Land Management, conducted a surveillance operation on the South Ridge. They were charged with theft of natural resources from a national park, destruction of protected plant species, and trespassing. Russell was also charged with wildlife harassment for the elk call mimicry, which was deemed to constitute interference with a protected species under the Lacey Act. The investigation revealed that the 2 men had harvested an estimated 40 to 60 pounds of wild ginseng from the park over the previous 2 seasons, worth tens of thousands of dollars on the export market. Most of it was sold to brokers in western North Carolina who shipped it overseas. The ginseng beds they had been poaching were some of the oldest and most ecologically significant in the park, with individual plants estimated to be 40 to 60 years old. Each plant dug up represented decades of growth that could not be replaced. I finished my photo essay that December. The elk images were good. The magazine ran the piece in their spring issue with a full spread of the Cataloochee herd in morning fog. But the images I think about most are the ones I took at that fire pit on the South Ridge, the PVC call, the binoculars, the view downhill through the trees to the meadow where I had been sleeping for nearly a week, visible and exposed and completely unaware that someone was sitting in the dark above me, watching. If you spend time in the backcountry, particularly in the Appalachian Range where ginseng and other high-value botanicals grow, understand that poaching is a serious and ongoing problem. Poachers may use deterrent tactics including fake animal calls, intentional noise, or visual signals to keep hikers away from their harvest areas. If you hear animal vocalizations that seem out of place, out of season, or coming from unusual locations, report it to park rangers. Do not investigate alone, no matter how confident you feel. These operations can involve people who are desperate and protective of income streams worth thousands of dollars per season, and the remote terrain they work in is specifically chosen because help is far away.